little bit about pre-notes and how they're used, and then I believe after that, we're going to talk about returns and notifications of change. So pre-notification, what is it? It is a non-monetary entry, meaning it's $0. There's no money that moves with a pre-note. And this is going from an originator to a receiver's account in anticipation of future entries. So if you have a brand new customer or client, or somebody has changed accounts and you want to verify that that account is truly an open and active account that is ready to receive an ACH entry, you could send a pre-note. We did AAP training with some of our members a couple of weeks ago, and somebody described this as a ping, right? Think about a ping out into the network to say, hey, does this account exist? And the receiving institution is going to just accept that ping and say, yep, that account's good. Or they might return it and say, no, that's not good information. You need to work with your receiver and get new information. So it's used to verify that a receiver's account number is a valid account number at the receiving institution. It does not necessarily verify account ownership. So it's not necessarily going to check the name on the account versus the name on the entries. There are some institutions that do that, but it's not guaranteed. So something to know about pre-notifications, they are optional on the origination side. So you as an originator could use pre-notifications, or you could use some other way to verify account numbers before you're sending those first entries. So optional for you as an originator. So if you're going to send them, you've got to comply with all the rules that go along with that. We'll talk about that on the next slide. And as an originator, if you're going to send that pre-note, you have got to wait a little bit, give the receiving institution some time to get that pre-note and react to it. You have to wait until at least the third banking day from settlement date before you send a live dollar entry. Meaning, if we send a pre-note on Monday and it settles on Tuesday, we've got to wait 3 banking days from Tuesday, which is going to be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Then on Friday, we could send that live entry. So make sure you understand how that works. You may also have systems that kind of do this for you in the background, where they're sending a pre-note. They won't let you set up a live entry until that waiting period passes. So just understand that you do have a waiting period when it comes to pre-notes if you choose to send those. All right. As I mentioned, we have some rules or some things we need to know when it comes to a pre-note. So if we're going to send them, we've got to wait the 3 days. But also, if we have a pre-note that is returned or a notification of change is received by the ODFI, so if CCF Bank receives that notification of change or that return, and they do that by the opening of business on the second banking day following the settlement date of the pre-note, they've got some timing requirements to meet. So ODFI is going to provide that information to you, the originator. So CCF Bank is likely going to have a mechanism to get this information to you. That's where you step in as the originator, and you're going to take a look at the information that you received and fix the issue. So looking at the return reason or the change code that comes in, maybe we transposed a couple of numbers in the account number, or maybe we had it set up as a savings account, but it really should have been a checking account. Those are the things we're going to look at based on the information that comes into us, check our system and see what's wrong, and then we can make those changes. We need to remedy the reason for that NOC before we send another entry. So if we're sending entries, we get this notification of change or we get that return, we have to act on that, right? We need to act on that. We'll talk a little bit more about notifications of change specifically in a moment, but if it's related to a pre-note, we have to act on that before we send another entry. So we can't just send a live entry and let this pre-note return or notification of change just sit off in the background and not do anything with it, right? So the intention here is to make sure that when we're sending those live entries, the ones that have money attached to them, they're getting to the right place. They're getting to an open and active valid account. And so this is going to help reduce returns and also reduce maybe some inconvenience or some stress on your receivers if they're waiting for entries to come in. They think it's going to come in, that they had account information was wrong. That's going to cause some real big issues for your customers and your clients. So this is going to help remedy that. All right, moving on to notifications of change. So going a little bit deeper than what we just talked about related to the pre-note, this is related to really any entry. So what is a notification of change? In the middle of the slide here, we've got, this is a non-monetary entry. So similar to the pre-note, this is a $0 entry, and it's just transmitting information. It's going from the RDFI, or that receiver's financial institution, to the ODFI and the originator to provide correct information that should be used for future entries. We've got an example that we'll walk through here in just a moment. But think about this, it's basically a message going from that receiving institution to ODFI and originator to say, hey, something was wrong with the information, and we want you to correct it before you send future entries. So now let's walk through an example here. Let's think about a utility company that is sending a debit to a homeowner for their water bill. So we're going to say that on October the 29th, again, we just kind of make some dates up sometimes, utility sends that same day ACH debit through the network in order to collect from the homeowner that has enrolled in the payment. So we've got that going out there. We saw the file go through. On November the 1st, the RDFI finds that entry on their non-post record. So RDFI, receiving institution, didn't know what to do with this entry, right? It showed up on an exception report that they have to work through. So they couldn't figure out where they needed to post the entry, or they couldn't post the entry, sorry, because the homeowner's account number contained an incorrect account number. It was off by one number in the final digit. So the entry had the number 0 at the end, but the correct account number ended in a 9. So now the RDFI, based mostly on correct account number and other information included in the entry, contacts the homeowner and confirms that the debit truly was authorized, and the RDFI decides to manually post the entry to that homeowner's account, decides to send back a notification of change to the ODFI with the correct account number. So that's what we're going to see happening next, is that COR, or the notification of change, going back to the ODFI to say, hey, you had the wrong information, so you need to let the originator know that, hey, we need to change the account number. It ended in 0, really should end in the number 9. So ODFI is going to, like I said, pass that information along to the originator, and then originator, or you in this example, you're going to make the change, right? You're going to fix the account number before we send another live entry. So we're going to get that fixed. So let's say this is monthly billing. Before next month's water bill goes out, we're going to have this fixed so we have the correct account number in our system, so that our receiver is going to get that debit to their account automatically. Their institution isn't going to have to fix anything on the back end. All right. When we talk about notifications of change, ODFI, or CCF Bank, has an obligation to provide you, the originator, with this information within 2 banking days of the settlement date of that notification of change or a corrected notification of change. You see everything listed here on this slide. So things like the company name, company ID, all that way down. A lot of this information is going to come directly from the entry. They're going to pass it back to you as the originator so that you can find this entry in your system, figuring out when did we originate, which entry are we talking about, and then what information needs to be changed so that you can make those changes. So this is the information that you're going to receive from CCF Bank to say, hey, you had a notification of change. Here is all of this information for you to identify the entry or the receiver and then make the changes. All right, you as an originator, you have a time period here. Time clock starts. So once you receive that notification entry, you need to make those changes from within 6 banking days of receiving that information, or prior to initiating another entry, whichever is later. There's some exceptions. We'll talk about that in a moment. But essentially, if we're talking about monthly billing, we're only sending these entries once a month, then we're likely going to just make the change before we send the next entry. It'll say they're weekly entries, though. That's where that 6 banking days might come in. Maybe we don't have time to make it before the next entry, but before the one after that, we would definitely be able to get those changes made. So there are some exceptions, as I mentioned. So if we're talking about a single entry, meaning the originator is only sending one entry, we're not going to send another entry, it wasn't recurring or anything like that, we don't have to make those changes. You could, that way your system was updated if that receiver wants to use that account information again, but the requirement says if it's a single entry, it's at the originator's discretion. The next one doesn't really apply to you unless you're doing CIE or web credit entries, but essentially saying a service provider or the originating institution would make those changes. And then we talked about the pre-note as well a few moments ago, so we won't go too deep into that, but just giving that time frame related to the notification of change related to a pre-note and the live entries. We do have that listed here in a calendar view that we can talk about. So kind of pulling together the notification of change and the pre-note that we've already talked about. So if we send our pre-note on Monday, it settles on Tuesday. Notification of change is sent on Wednesday. ODFI receives that on Thursday. Originator could may send that entry if correction is made on Friday. And then Monday is when the originator would need to provide ODFI would need to provide originator with the information. So you see an issue here, right? We can send an entry on Friday, but we don't have to have the NOC information until Monday. So that's what we're talking about here, is if the originator doesn't receive it within that 2 banking days, they do have a little bit more time to make those changes. And this is showing where the NOC is not received by the opening of business. So we have a pre-note sent on Monday, settling on Tuesday. RDFI doesn't send that notification of change until Thursday. RDFI receives it on Friday, or sorry, ODFI receives on Friday. Originator can also send entries on Friday, and then ODFI would be required to get that information to the originator by the following Tuesday. So you can see why sometimes you'll send a pre-note or receive a pre-note and then things are wrong and a second entry or another entry comes in and things are still wrong. That's just because of the timing of things. Everything should shake out within a couple of days. All right, let's talk a little bit about return entries next. So we're going to spend some time here talking about the returns. So ODFI, so CCF Bank, must accept timely returns that comply with the rules. So an ODFI may agree to accept a late return at their discretion. So there are some situations where an RDFI may contact an ODFI and say, hey, we need to return this entry late because maybe it wasn't authorized. Maybe ODFI and originator don't have an authorization. And so they say, you know what, RDFI, just go ahead and return it late. That's what we're talking about here. There are some situations where an ODFI could accept a late return. Always going to be at their discretion though. But really what we're saying here is that an ODFI cannot dispute a return unless there was something wrong with it, if it didn't comply with the rules or if it wasn't timely. So when you get a return back saying that an entry was unauthorized, but you have an authorization, your institution cannot refuse that return because you're saying it was authorized. Ultimately, at that point, it goes outside of the ACH network and you would have to take up your claim with the receiver. So that's important to understand when we talk about accepting those returns that comply with the rules. That's what we're saying. So let's look at the ACH return flow. So we use these diagrams a lot when we're training about these time frames. So we have the ODFI or CCF Bank over there on the left. We have the RDFI over there on the right, and that would be your customer, your client, your receiver, their financial institution. So our original entry goes from the ODFI to the RDFI. RDFI is going to attempt to post that entry, but sometimes they're not able to. Maybe there aren't sufficient funds. Maybe the account number is invalid or it's a closed account. They could choose to make a return. Now we say opening of business on the second banking day is the time frame here. That is for most of our returns. So our general return time frame, those entries need to be back to the ODFI by the opening of business on the second banking day following the settlement date of the initial entry. You see a little star there because there are some exceptions that exist, like those extended return timeframes that we talked about for those consumer unauthorized transactions. All right, so now our return is sitting over there at the ODFI. So this would be CCF Bank. They would take a look at that return, most of the time they're probably going to just accept the return, but there could be situations where they could dishonor the return, saying, hey, RDFI, this return isn't ours, this return is a duplicate, this return is untimely, those sorts of things. They could dishonor that return back to the RDFI and say, we're not taking this. At that point, RDFI then has 2 banking days where they could contest or correct that dishonored return. At that point, it goes outside of the ACH network. So if there are still issues here, it's between either you and your customer or between CCF Bank and the RDFI, but the ACH network return process stops at that contested or corrected return. All right, so let's talk a little bit about that return piece. That's where we're going to spend the most of our time here. There are a couple of different types of returns. So we want to understand, what do we do next, right? We've received the return. We know that there could be some situations where CCF Bank can dishonor, but for the most part, we're probably going to have to decide, what do we do next? So if we have return entries that are administrative, so things like account closed, no account, or invalid account structure, those type of things, you'll want to stop originating for that particular customer or client and contact them for valid account information. So maybe their account was closed because they had some fraud and they needed to reopen a new account, or maybe they changed financial institutions and that you need to get a new authorization from them. Could also be that maybe you transposed some numbers when you were typing in the account number, or maybe the customer or client transposed numbers when they gave them to you. So that sort of thing, you'd want to reach out and verify the account information to make sure that we have valid account information so that we can try to send a new entry with a new authorization to an account that is not closed or that does have a valid account number structure. Next thing we want to talk about are stop payment returns. So if you receive an entry that comes back to you as payment stopped, here you're going to want to contact that customer or that client and really figure out kind of what happened, right? Did they just stop that one entry? Are they stopping all of the subsequent entries? Also, it could be that they stopped one entry, but the two of you can work out the differences and they'll allow you to resend that entry. That does happen from time to time, and that is allowable under the rules. So as long as your receiver says, you know what, I've removed the stop payment, we're good to go, you can go ahead and send that entry. You can absolutely send a new entry from that stop payment return. But that's where you'll want to reach out, ask the questions. Are you stopping all of the entries? Did you just stop the one entry? And then if there is a debt that is owed at that point, it may have to go outside of the ACH network. If you do, if they do it really owe you money and they've stopped payment on the payment to collect that. Last one would be those unauthorized returns. We want to stop origination until we have a new authorization. So remember, those unauthorized returns, those could be coming from our consumers, could be coming up to 60 days after the settlement date of that entry. So we would want to do a little bit of research. We don't want to send any more entries until we have a new authorization that is a valid authorization saying that they are going to allow us to send further entries. If we're talking about a non-consumer receiver, we're still going to want to get a new authorization, but remember, those returns can only come to us under that general return time frame, which is about 2 banking days. So big difference there, again, between that consumer receiver and that non-consumer receiver when it comes to unauthorized entries. And I kind of already touched on this, but I have a note for this slide that says, what about an unauthorized return where you truly have a valid authorization? This happens a lot. If you have an agreement with that receiver and they still owe you money, you may not be able to collect it via the ACH network. However, you could look to an agreement that you have with that customer or that client to see if there are options for things like collections or civil court. You're not done just because they sent an unauthorized return or a stop payment, but you may be done as far as the ACH network is concerned. So that's important to understand as well, because I got that question a lot at the bank that I worked at. Our originators would send those entries. They would come back unauthorized and they're like, it's authorized, I have an authorization. And we would let them know, look, you're going to have to go to the agreement you have with your customer and figure out how you're going to collect those funds, because they do owe you money. We just can't do it through ACH.